So, sometime in October in Wilmington, North Carolina, a group of mostly men, but some women too, stood on the roadside outside the port of Wilmington. They were cheering and holding up signs. It was like a moment from another era, before right to work states and mega yachts and billionaires became a thing, the 80s or maybe the 70s. Sometime before, as a culture, we began to see labor organizing as somehow being wrong, a way of sitting around complaining when you could be finding a new job or finding some other ambitious answer to your problem. You don't like working for Amazon? Well, just go out there and build a competitor.
My name is Charles Seaton. I am ILA Local President 1766. Our press point is no automation. We want to stop automation, which is save American jobs. These are foreign-owned companies that we work for. They want to increase automation throughout this particular contract. We want to stop it because it results in us losing our jobs. We want to embrace technology. You know, technology is here, it's coming, it's going to be coming, but train us to do those jobs. Plus, we want higher wages. We worked during the pandemic. We hit the bricks day and night while everybody else was locked in. We had many an ILA member that passed away from COVID. We got $4 over our last 6-year contract, and we're expecting the shippers to do better, to treat us better than that.
Here's the deal. Over the past year, dock workers at ports across the U.S. have been striking for better pay, safer working conditions, and a fair share of the record profits ports have raked. They're in a good position to negotiate. The country really can't get along without them.
Most products now are containerized, and that is the biggest mode of transportation to get goods in. We take the containers off the ship, and the truckers come and pick them up and deliver them to either the warehouses or they go to the customer. You know, dray them right to the customer. But we work 24/7.
Charles talks about how wages have fallen behind inflation and how it's creating challenges for hourly workers who basically risk their lives to do this work. In addition to things like COVID, dock workers have accidents. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the agency that tracks things like this, says the most frequent cause of longshoring fatalities are accidents in which employees are struck by or run over by vehicles like trucks, front-end loaders, or forklifts. The next most frequent cause of death was by falling or drowning, and then the remaining fatalities occurred while employees were performing a variety of what they call cargo and material handling activities involving things like improperly loaded forklifts, unstable cargo that suddenly toppled over, and working below improperly secured loads that fell from cranes. It's been hard for dock workers to get raises that compensate them for such risks.
I think we got $1 in the second year, $1 in the fourth, fifth, and sixth year, you know. But $4 did not outlast inflation, and the ship owners are making money hand over fist. You know, $300 billion last year. So all we're asking for is a fair wage for what we do for them. Outside the ILA community, very few realize how we work, how we have to work. And like I said, there's no salaried jobs. It's all hourly, and it's all on a seniority basis. So there's some that are working a lot, and there's some that's working very few. But in order to keep people in this particular industry and keep viable workers to be able to perform the jobs, the wage has to get up. Well, not only fair wages, but a decent retirement. You know, you could I've been down here over 50 years. I want to be able to retire with dignity. I can't right now because of the amount of money in this particular port on our retirement system. But everybody needs a good wage, a decent retirement, and health care benefits, for your family.
Of course, at this point, you have to wonder, for companies, what's the incentive? Those accidents workers get into, automation could help make them a thing of the past. As companies convert to automation, they're relying more and more on things like self-driving forklifts.
Well, we know it's coming, and that's why we're trying to. That's why we're trying to out here striking to keep automation and AI out of our jobs. There's some ports around the world where there's no workers. It's nothing but cables and programmers. And like I said, we want to be trained. If it's going to that, then we want to maintain a position in the workforce because it's American jobs.
American jobs, sure, but hanging out at the strike, which did win dock workers some concessions, by the way, it was hard not to notice that most of the people on the picket line were specifically African American. In coastal North Carolina, that turns out to be part of a long legacy, one where work was power, and that legacy may soon be automated away. Welcome to Shoresides. I'm your host, Ren Smith.
Yeah, if you had come down to the harbor in Wilmington, North Carolina, or if you had gone out to the Outer Banks and looked out on the water, or if you had gone upriver between, say, Fayetteville and Wilmington and looked out across the water, often all the only people you would have seen would have been enslaved African Americans. And they did everything on the water. They were ship pilots. They ran the crews of the revenue cutters. They were ferrymen. They were fishermen. They went and they fished in large commercial fisheries that involved thousands of people. But they also fished, enslaved people often fished for their own survival as a way of building a little bit of space between them and the people who enslaved them. I don't need to rely on you because at night, one slave, Alan Parker, a slave in Chowan County, North Carolina, said, night is the slave's holiday. You work all day, you work hard, but then you slip out and you head down to the creek. And Parker's good on this because when Parker wrote about his life as a waterman years after the Civil War, he said, for people who had been enslaved, he called it the book of nature. He said, we knew the book of nature better than they did because we had to. At night, we had to know where the fish were. We had to know how to be quiet. We had to know exactly what season to do things. We couldn't afford not to know. So that world of African American maritime laborers was not only a foundation of the economy that the world of planters and white merchants couldn't do without, but it also meant that those black watermen were the center of, if you wanted to know what was happening in other parts of the world, or if you wanted to know what was happening just upriver, those enslaved watermen and women were the conduit. They were the ones spreading the word, and they were spreading it all the way deep into North Carolina, but they were also sharing news from the Caribbean and from New England and from Europe. And they knew there was a different world. Many of the seamen, particularly the African American seamen, I remember one says, we knew that in London we went arm in arm with white women. We knew that what we were seeing here in the South, what they were telling us was God's will, was not what was happening in the rest of the world. And they tended to be a relatively sophisticated set of people. It wasn't unusual, particularly on the coast, for an enslaved waterman to speak 5 or 6 languages. I remember reading of a slave named Peter who escaped in New Bern in 1794. and escaped off of a ship. And the owner, when he put an advertisement in the newspaper offering a reward for his capture, said, Peter has been to the sea all his life and speaks French, Dutch, Spanish, and English. And he probably spoke African languages at that point. So this was a whole world that was out there that was not, it might have been connected to the cotton plantation. It might have been connected to the kind of field labor that we usually think about with slavery. But this was different. My name is David Siselsky. I grew up on the North Carolina coast near Beaufort, North Carolina. My wife and I still have the small family farm where we grew up, and that has been connected to my family for more than 3 centuries. I ran off and studied history at Duke and then at Harvard, and I've been writing and teaching about the history of the North Carolina coast ever since. And I'm a world and a grain of sand kind of guy, and my grain of sand has been this area that I'm from, the North Carolina coast.
So David has an excellent book on that history called The Waterman Song, which is available on Amazon. And it was all inspired by a personal curiosity.
I'm interested in all different parts of North Carolina's coastal history, but especially when I was young, when I began my work, I was taught in the history that I saw in coastal museums and that you learned about in books. It was as if African American peoples didn't exist on the North Carolina coast. And to be honest, that's only improved marginally from my point of view today, when in fact African Americans made up the majority of the people in most coastal counties. And I did grow up in a place where the African American maritime presence was all around me. The community I come from is majority African American and Native American. People worked on the water. They told stories about ancestors who sailed the seas. I grew up with those people. I went to school with them, and I'm family with quite a lot of them. And to be honest, I heard so many stories from so many of the African American elders in our community growing up that before I went to school, before I went off, I assumed that everybody would know this. And as I studied North Carolina's coastal history, once you start looking, African American watermen and women are everywhere. And they're not only there as laborers, but every time there's a slave revolt, every time there's a slave conspiracy, every time African American watermen and women are always in the middle of it. Something's going on there. I also learned very early on that as I went through the historical records doing other kinds of research, I kept running across stories of the Underground Railroad, and it was always by sea on the North Carolina coast. This idea of going north 20 miles at a time in the hay wagon with some nice Quaker people, I'm sure that happened sometimes. Maybe in other places it happened a lot. But on the North Carolina coast, what happened is that it really anywhere this side of the Appalachian Mountains, people headed east. They headed to the sea. And what they sought to do was to disappear into the African American maritime world that could get them down rivers, that could get them to ports, that could get them concealed aboard a ship headed north. If you were working at one of the great herring fisheries on Albemarle Sound as an enslaved, that they were using nets that were more than a mile long. They would sometimes catch more than 100,000 fish in a single haul. These were nets long enough to go across entire mouths of rivers. To haul them in, they needed all those people, but they also used horses that would turn giant, cranks, capstans. to haul these nets in. Everybody at the fishery, except the owner, was going to be African American. They worked 7 days a week, 6 or 8 weeks a year. The men were out on the water in that case. But just as many women were there heading fish, salting fish, packing them in barrels, working night and day just as hard as the men. But women also went off on their own and caught fish and oystered enslaved women. And in that case, it was more often something that they were doing secretly, something that they were doing on their own to feed their families. But on one hand, African American watermen and women often had a kind of freedom or mobility that was incomparably greater than other kind of enslaved people. But they were still operating in a system that was as oppressive as you could get. And when I teach about that subject, I often tell about the story of an enslaved waterman named Moses Grandy. And Grandy grew up around in 1810, 1820, down near Elizabeth City, North Carolina. And he starts, when he's just a small boy, the man who claims him as property puts him to work running a little ferry across a very small little creek. People come down, they want to get across the creek. They give him a shilling or whatever, silver eagle, and that goes directly to his owner, who runs a tavern there by the creek. He takes him across the creek. That's his job. Moses Grandy does well at it. He's making money for this guy. He starts to have him run boats carrying shingles out of the Great Dismal Swamp. Turns out a lot of the free people, probably whites, that were on the boat with him turn out not to be that reliable. The owner wants to make money. He keeps giving Moses Grandy more authority until Grandy is actually the captain of his own vessel that is sailing all throughout the Albemarle Sound area. He's entrusted to make his own deals, picking up lumber or barrels of salt herring or beef or whatever it is. He pays a fixed amount. I think he's expected to have profit of $600 every year that goes to his owner. But his owner, to get him to work more, says anything beyond that, you keep. So he actually tries to buy his freedom 2 or 3 times. His owner often doesn't see him for weeks or even months at a time. There's no white person on his vessel. So on one hand, that's a kind of like an image out of our slave past that you just don't usually think of. And who knows who he's helping get up the road or what's going on. But people ask me, why didn't Moses Grandy just take the boat and go? Head north. And that did happen sometimes. But Moses Grandy's case is very instructive because every few years, his owner would do something to remind him that he had a lot to lose and that he was still a slave. And the first thing he did was sell his wife. Not for any reason, not because he needed the money, not because Moses Grandy wasn't profitable. He did it to make a point. And then a few years later, he sold one of his daughters. And then he sold another daughter. This went on for years. It was just a little reminder. You can leave. I know you can leave. But I'll destroy your world. And if he had been a different kind of person, like somebody who didn't have anything to lose, somebody that didn't love his mama, it's very unlikely he would have been given that kind of responsibility. So in a way, Moses Grandy's life captures that dual nature of maritime life for African Americans. Like on one hand, he has a kind of freedom and the ability to be on his own and even to be, as John Lewis said, a good troublemaker. in the shadows, but he was also in this larger system. And the merchants and planters that owned slaves relied on African American watermen so much that they were in a way torn in half too, because on one hand, they wanted to give them as much freedom to use the skills they had and the knowledge of the water to make money for them. And on the other hand, you give a man or woman a little bit of room, and the next thing you know, you have a slave revolt, or you have a lot of people escaping, and you can follow the laws of the period. Wilmington would start to lighten up the laws on what an African American waterman's responsibilities could be. And then something like the Nat Turner slave insurrection happens, and all of a sudden they're like, no, if a ship comes into Wilmington and the majority of the crew is African American, they can't even come to the wharf. And for a year or two that lasts, but then they notice that ships are going to Charleston instead, and they're losing money. So they lighten up, and it's back and forth like that the whole time. And you see it. There was an enslaved man named Peter in Wilmington Harbor, who was at the center of the Underground Railroad there. And he was a harbor pilot, which meant he was out working on the water, helping guide other vessels up the river and in the harbor. And while he was out there, he would identify abolitionists, people, anti-slavery people, or people that maybe they didn't care that much. Maybe they could just be bought. You know what I mean? Like someone who would take a bribe. And so if you were a slave somewhere near Wilmington, you knew that you needed to get into Wilmington and make contact with Peter. Peter then connects you with this broader world that's both black and white that might get you north. Peter is eventually caught. He operates for years, but he's eventually caught. He is sold to the Deep South, probably to a sugarcane or cotton plantation. His family never sees him again. And they also catch 2 white oystermen that they were working with. And one of them, I guess today we'd say he was disappeared. His family came back and there was a red cross on his door, and they never saw him again. The whole world of the Atlantic treated race a little different than like the South. There were a lot of ships where black and white served on equal terms. It was hard to find good sailors. It was so hard that they bent the rules. And they didn't just do it for African Americans. They were going all over the world, ships were, and they needed a system that would work. They were always short on good hands. They needed a system that would work with untouchables in India and with Bantu people in West Africa and with Hawaiian people. And what evolves is a system of running, we're talking big ships here, of running a ship that if you know that you're a seaman second class.
David notes that because of the nature of coastal work, it stripped away the social order, showed them what an equitable society might look like.
You're Wren-Smith, seaman second class. You don't even have to know how to speak the language. You know exactly what your jobs are on the ship. You know who you better say yes, sir, to, and you know who has to say yes, sir, to you. And you don't even speak the language necessarily. And so that whole world of the Black Atlantic was considered dangerous to the powerful people in the South. They didn't even want, if they could help it, they didn't want their enslaved people to see that world. When they came into Wilmington, they didn't want us to let a slave from the cotton field look out on the water and see a ship anchored where an African American man might be giving orders to a white person. You see what I'm saying? just the notion, it even helps us understand that what happens all those years later in 1898. They're trying to destroy this legacy, in my view. Like, that when freedom first comes, the most radical, the most democratic impulse in the nation isn't the abolitionists of the North.
David argues that while some might see it differently, this is where the American racial justice movement really starts.
It's the abolitionists on the North Carolina coast and a few other places, Louisiana, South Carolina, who came out of this world and are carrying like the vision that they had of a different way of treating people, of a more democratic, egalitarian society. It reminds me of the political moment we're in now, where you sometimes feel like there's two different whole ways of being and two different whole ways of thinking about the country. And nobody symbolizes the tradition of the little d democratic tradition more than this history of the watermen and women that came out of Wilmington and the North Carolina coast. Can I tell one little story? And then I'll be out of here and you can too. It's from my book, The Waterman's Song, but I've always liked it because it's a small little story, but it happened just a few miles from where I grew up on the North Carolina coast. In the 1850s, there was a young enslaved man, a boy, named William Henry Singleton. He went by Henry. And he was on a plantation at a place called Garbacon Creek. I think that when it was created, I think it would have been Garbesson Creek, like a French name, but we call it Garbacon Creek. And every few years, beginning when he's 6 or 7 years old, his owner sells him away from the plantation. Sometimes just a few miles down the road, other times, at one point, all the way to Georgia. And this young boy keeps escaping, and he doesn't head north. He doesn't head to the north. He's a young child. He heads back to his mother, right? He heads back to Mama, even though she's on the plantation that he was sold from. He gets back. But one time, when he had been sold, I forget, it was someplace far off, and he had traveled many days, and he had almost got back to the plantation, but there's a creek, it's called Adams Creek, which is a brackish saltwater bay off the Neuse River. And he gets to it, and it's dusk, it's getting dark. He can hear the dogs, so he can hear like the slave patrol that goes around looking for slaves who are not where they're supposed to be. And he knows he's going to get caught if he can't get across Adams Creek. He says, I looked out on the water and there was one individual out fishing in a boat, like a dugout boat. But because it was dusk, all I could see was his silhouette. And I couldn't tell if he was a black man or a white man. But then he says, I had never seen a white fisherman before. So I took my chances. And he signaled to the guy, and the guy came over. He turned out to be an African-American man, and he gave him a ride across the creek. And I just love that story because it tells you just how ubiquitous the African-American presence was on North Carolina waters in those days. And Singleton goes off. When the Civil War starts, he escapes to New Bern. He becomes one of the first African-American soldiers in what was called the African Brigade. And he's a sergeant in the Army during the war. But that one little moment is, out of all his memoirs, is probably my favorite.
It's a long and powerful history of Black work and subjectivity that's now under threat. And that's happening across industries. A 2019 McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility report, The Future of Work in Black America, finds that automation may exacerbate the racial wealth gap by disproportionately displacing Black workers concentrated in vulnerable occupations like truck drivers, food service workers, office clerks. We went to talk to someone who could give us some perspective on that.
My name is Portia Allen Kyle. I am the interim executive director here at Color of Change. We are a digital first civil rights racial justice organization powered by millions of members across the country, where we leverage campaigns and the power of narrative to hold corporations and government actors to take action on racial justice. And so I am a civil rights attorney by trade, have been pushing and working in racial justice spaces for the majority of my career. Color of Change was founded in 2005 in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And so that was for those who perhaps are too young to remember, a pivotal moment, particularly with regards to racial justice, where what we saw completely was that no one was afraid to disappoint Black people, not government, not corporations, not media in the coverage. And from that moment, Color of Change was founded by email sent out to about 1,000 people. And since that time, we have been, through our corporate accountability campaigns, through our campaigns holding media and government actors accountable, have been working to change the narrative on Black people, to hold the line on solutions that are real and move us forward by changing the rules, written and unwritten, about how we as a nation deal with race.
Even though Portia works at the intersection of race and technology, when it comes to Portia's relationship with advancements like AI, it's complicated.
I find that I am probably a little bit more resistant than average in terms of adopting AI and automation. And I think for me, it's a very personal question and calculation of, is this convenience or is this use worth the effects that it has on the world and on, other people, whether I know them or not, right? And so I don't think it is responsible to, as easy as it would be to plan a trip itinerary or, throw together a quick bio so I don't have to, write it myself, or, to smooth over, lately the commercials are, rewrite with a different tone. I think it is more socially responsible to use my brain for that and many other things, to kind of take on a little bit of the manual labor and the inconveniences. And I just somewhat fundamentally reject personally ideals of efficiency and productivity as being the driving values for good. And so in addition to the data privacy aspect, just as someone who has been subject to a number of data breaches by companies that I have never heard of and never entrusted my data, I'm a little bit wary of all of it. And that doesn't mean there aren't good uses. I like the concept of AI being used to solve challenging medical questions, to find new solutions and cures for long-standing diseases, to improve the quality of life or improve the distribution of benefits, or, work in those ways.
The ways in which AI can be used for good or ill has become a major focus point of a Color of Change campaign called Black Tech Agenda.
So the Black Tech Agenda that Color of Change has put forth, the first version of the Black Tech Agenda came out in 2022. It was at a time and in a moment that was focused a lot on the regulation of big tech, that was focused a lot on inclusion in the tech industry, who is at the table as things are being developed, and how we are taking the perspectives of a broader set of developers and talent into the mix to make decisions that are critical. And so I think, to a moment ago, I mentioned this question on values, intentional or not, it has been decided by some for the many that values around productivity, consumerism, efficiency, et cetera, are the values that are, and innovation for innovation's sake, are the values that are driving the quick proliferation and adoption of AI on a very many fronts. The Black Tech Agenda, in this iteration, we updated it and relaunched it late 2024. And the focus here has really been zooming out and much broader and, re-examining the positive use case, for example, like re-examining the sustainability impacts, re-examining, it's not just a question of how are students equipped to use AI in this digital world. That, like, to us is the wrong question. The question, for us is in this digital world that we now live in today, what are the skills, tools, and how does the education system need to change so that students are equipped to engage with digital futures? And like with a comprehensive understanding, companies start collecting data on kids as soon as parents post a picture that says, here's our new baby, right? And like kids are, now living in an age where they can develop, where companies can develop very specific long-term, like clear profiles and all of that information aggregated together. If kids don't know how and what types of data, how to interact, it's not just, how do we get on TikTok? They're using biometrics in school cafeterias to pay for lunches and things of that nature. And the Black Tech Agenda is meant to zoom out and address all of these kind of comprehensive challenges and promises and, perils and pitfalls simultaneously by really re-examining from a values and a civil rights perspective how we are thinking about who benefits, who is profiting, who is burdened, who is bearing the consequences of a lot of the development. And so the agenda runs the gamut on everything from the environmental impacts to the impact on Black creatives who are using social media infrastructure to advance their work and get their work out there, to the impacts on jobs and labor that automation poses, and really meant to take a more comprehensive look at the ways in which technology has, it isn't just theoretical anymore. The proliferation of technology into every aspect of our lives is.
Portia didn't seem surprised to hear about what was happening in Wilmington.
I think one of the concerns, just very frankly, is, this AI is going to take our jobs. We're all going to be replaced by robots in some way, shape, or form. And I think in some ways, in some industries, those fears are not just fears. We have seen in service industries, for example, with the kind of advent of self-checkout and other things. I mean, even as we've moved from shopping in person to the internet, we've seen a shift in the types of jobs needed and what is required to deliver those products and carry out those businesses. And so I think the kind of automation aspects of work and certain types of work are critical. And from that perspective, it is possible and likely in some places that there are some tasks that can be automated, but that doesn't mean that it takes a job. And so how AI is developed and how it is deployed should include those who are impacted at the center of the decision making. It should include some oversight in terms of that. Companies should be required to be very transparent around where jobs and what types and what level of jobs are being shifted from previously held by a person to either being supplemented, augmented, or replaced by automation. And it is very apparent and clear in jobs like you mentioned, dock workers, maritime employees in car manufacturing, things of that nature, the kind of roles of automation there.
Like the McKinsey report, Portia mentioned that Black dock workers aren't the only Black laborers in trouble.
I think the other thing to really be concerned about from a labor perspective is the transformation of what we sometimes think of as more white collar or knowledge work as well. With the use of ChatGPT, right, and Gemini and other things, it is a lot easier to replace, for example, middle management who previously did things like schedule, assign tasks, manage productivity, et cetera, in those ways, than it is to replace those who are carrying out the tasks. What we're seeing in some places and we'll continue to see in others is a kind of hollowing out of middle management, and that will have implications on economic mobility for workers, where there just may not be as many places to move up to as that middle management aspect is streamlined. I think the other thing, particularly in industries like the maritime industry, is concerns around the use of AI and tools to monitor productivity. It is a different type of surveillance that workers will be subject to that I think we do not have the strongest labor laws here in the United States. We do not have the strongest worker protections. And while, there has been some significant momentum and unionization and strong union protections are part of that, the collection of data by employers that could include the monitoring of steps, the completion of tasks, like in some, cases with like wearable devices, right? Like it can monitor your heart rate. And like we should be very concerned about companies taking in personal employee biometric data and making decisions about productivity and work and all of those and performance, right? And all of those things where we know that these decisions can be discriminatory against people with disabilities, like discriminatory against people perhaps who are aging or have mobility challenges, discriminatory in a number of different ways that are and should be illegal.
Going back to what David was saying, you can imagine that if that level of control had been available to the ruling class of Wilmington during slavery, it would have given them exactly the sense of control they needed to put down Black autonomy and resistance.
Unfortunately, it is left to dock workers to, push and agitate and fight, and fight for themselves, their rights, their jobs, etc. We don't know how many jobs across industry have been replaced through automation. And like the time to begin to figure that out was when we saw the change in the auto industry. And in factories and manufacturing and things of that nature, we're already behind in so many different ways. I think anything is possible and people should fight for that. But what is really needed is a system and mechanism of oversight and transparency around what are very meaningful shifts to the economy that companies take on their own and make those decisions that are driven mostly by profit. And profit-seeking, profit-driven decisions often are not what's best for communities and certainly not what's best for Black people.
Portia says that while we might be used to organizing around markets and capital, in this moment in which we, everyone, might suddenly find themselves irrelevant to modes of production, this is where we decide we mean something more to each other than the products and services we produce.
Profit and the desire for it shouldn't speak for the rest of us. And the way to push back and the need to push back and the why of pushing back, why is really centered around are the values that are put forth by these corporations, the values that should guide the technological development of society. For us, part of those values should be civil rights and racial justice as a strategy and not just an outcome. Right? Equity is a strategy in development so that things are being developed with care for all in mind, developed with inclusiveness in mind, developed in a way that augments and doesn't, replace, developed in a way that, and maybe there are some places where, replacing is necessary, but what's the broader strategy that we have to retrain and retool and make sure that as technology is shifting the labor market and shifting jobs and, what work looks like, that it isn't leaving behind whole segments of the population with no solution, no opportunities, no options for meeting their basic needs, feeding their families. What I would say is automating inequality is a choice. And so far we have made, collectively we, not Black people and Black communities, but insofar as other folks in the Silicon Valley and Wall Street, startup tech owners have been allowed to drive the conversation and our vision for the future. The decisions that have come with that is the automation of inequality and the coming of, huge rifts in opportunity and rifts in the social infrastructure and stratification that by race, right, by gender, by any demographic you can think of, And I think that we need to collectively decide that we want something different and build power to organize, around that, to socialize and hold the line on which solutions are real and which are not. We will not code ourselves to justice. That's not the solution. We will not, right, prompt our way, in these models to a more just outcome. It is oversight, regulation, and systems change. There is something to universal income, but there's something to universal income that is, for us, not just about the number of universal income. You can say a number and it'll never be enough as, inflation rises, as, the cost of living rises and all of the things. But kind of zooming out, we need a redistribution of wealth, in this country, and thinking of universal basic income as a kind of pathway and one perhaps more redistributional policy that is needed alongside a number of other policies that also promote redistribution, because we can raise the bottom as much as we want, but as long as we're still creating more and more billionaires, more and more millionaires, and really at the expense of everybody else, it's only a patch and not a system solve.
That concludes this episode. Thank you for joining us. We hope you gained a deeper understanding of the challenges and triumphs experienced by the vibrant communities of coastal North Carolina. Remember, the stories we explore here shape the path ahead. Thanks for listening. Learn more about Shoresides at www.shoresides.org. I'm Ren Smith. Again, thanks for listening.